So welcome all participants to the webinar today. This is a series of webinars that we organize occasionally to share the findings from the work we do with the Malabo-Montpellier panel. Let me share with you a little bit on the background of the panel. It is composed of about 18 international and African experts. 80% of the membership are African experts in the area of food security, agriculture, economic development, nutrition. The work of the panel is a little bit specific. We do research, we produce reports, but the reports that we share and prepare are not looking at the complexity of things, trying to explain the status of things and understanding how things work and don't work in terms of their properties and so on. What we're trying to do is very simple. It is to find out across Africa good practices that have produced results that can be imitated and scaled up. And the reason why we're doing that, we're saying to ourselves that the last 20 years, before we hit the pandemic, were the most successful years in terms of economic development in Africa's post-independent history. We had a steady, sustained rate of growth. We have a steady decline in terms of rate of poverty, rate of malnutrition, hunger, and the like. Increasing GDP per capita, rising middle class. A lot of things happened, not just in one or two countries, but in also one or two countries, but also across the continent. What it meant is that there was something working on the ground. Although we're very far away from where we would like to be, it is by learning from what has worked that we can do things better and maintain what has worked and scale it up. So what our work is, therefore, we look at a specific thematic area that is of strategic importance to the African agenda. Then we find a way of evaluating and ranking African countries. And we take the top 6 performers and we go there and ask ourselves, what did the governments in those countries do in terms of institutional innovation, policy innovation, programmatic implementation, in order to advance the agenda and move the dial. Then it is a summary from those observations that we then put our reports together to give ideas to other African governments. And this is the key. We focus only on government actions. What other governments can do, can learn from their peers, can adopt and replicate in order to achieve the same type of success. We have done half a dozen reports so far, and the latest of our reports is on livestock, a modern strategic sector in Africa, where we have huge potential, but have been struggling to make a lot of progress. And we had the opportunity and the chance and the honor to have leading experts in that area, like Ian Wright, who is here with us today, to advise as we're putting that report together. Another opportunity to say thank you to you, Ian, for the leadership you and the advice you gave in putting together that report. So Ian is joining us here today from the International Livestock Research Institute based in Nairobi. Of course, most of you would know that, the foremost livestock research center in Africa and one of the most important across the globe. So we're happy to have you here and welcome you. And what I will do now is to transfer the floor to you, and we look forward to listening to you and joining in the discussion later on. Thank you, Ian, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Usman, for that introduction. And first of all, I want to thank you and the other members of the Malabo-Montpellier panel for giving me the opportunity to engage in this webinar, as I know it's part of a series of webinars that you've been organizing in the last few weeks, and I think there's one more in the series. Let me share. I'm having difficulty sharing my screen because someone else is sharing. Let me try again.
Chair, is it you?
Yeah.
Can you try again, please?
Yeah. Okay, can I confirm that you can see it?
Sure, we can.
Yeah, let me put it on. Presentation mode. Let me close my.
We can see your presentation, Ian.
Okay, good. Right, thanks. So thanks, Usman. What I want to do in the next half hour or so is kind of set the scene in relation to the livestock sector globally and specifically within Africa and its role and contribution to the development of the continent, and then move on to some examples of things that can be done to promote the sector, to stimulate investment in livestock, so that livestock can really contribute to its full extent to the development of countries in Africa. So let me begin by saying a few words about livestock globally. We know that the demand for livestock products in low and middle income countries is increasing rapidly. This shows the projections to 2030, but we have projections that go through to 2050, demonstrating that whether we're talking about beef, pork, poultry, milk, that in low and middle income countries, the demand is rising very quickly. You can see the fourth histogram in each of these graphs for sub-Saharan Africa, where for most commodities, depending on the region and the commodity, the demand is likely to double or triple in Africa by 2050. And of course, that compares hugely with the projected demand and growth in high-income countries, which is more or less static. I like to tease my North American colleagues by saying, you know, there's only so much beef that North Americans can consume. And this increase in demand is coming from a very low base. So this increase in demand is not going to result in huge overconsumption, at least not on average, because if you look at the consumption of meat, for example, the OECD average 2018 was nearly 70 kilograms per capita. In sub-Saharan Africa, it was under 10 kilograms per capita. And most of those products are produced by small-scale farmers. Here you can see in Africa, 72%. Now, this is a global map, which defines small-scale farmers as 20 hectares or less. And of course, in Africa, most farms are much, much smaller than that. Nevertheless, the vast majority of livestock-derived foods are produced by small-scale farmers with less than 5, less than 2, often less than 1 hectare. And you could argue that livestock has an impact on, or is related to all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But livestock has got a particular contribution to make to the 8 development goals highlighted in the middle of this, this slide. And you can actually argue that, you know, without livestock, it will not be possible to achieve those SDGs by 2030. In relation to the role of livestock to food and nutrition security, if you look at the nutritional divides around the world, the 7.5 million people in the world, only about a third are well-fed and well-nourished. There's another third, or almost a third, that is overfed, overnourished. And we know that that causes all sorts of issues around obesity, public health issues, around diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on. And that leaves about a third of the world's population, mainly in low and middle income countries, which are either hungry. There are still 800 million people around the world that go to bed hungry every night. There are 150 odd million children that are stunted. And there's a large proportion of the population that may be consuming sufficient calories, but they're not well nourished in terms of protein consumption and consumption of micronutrients. In Africa, about 30% of children under the 5 years of age are stunted. And a report by the World Bank a couple of years ago estimated that Africa is losing about 10% of its GDP due to stunting. Because stunting is not just a physical phenomenon. Stunting limits cognitive development, it limits learning ability, and therefore children who are stunted for life, not just physically, but in terms of brain development and so on. And therefore, they're not contributing to the full extent that they could do to the economic growth of countries in Africa. But we know that meat, milk, and eggs provide key nutrients, particularly vitamins such as A, B12, choline, iron, and zinc, either in higher quantities or in higher bioavailable forms than plant-based diets. Vitamin B12, for example, is not available naturally in plants. It's only available in animal-sourced foods. And these micronutrients are critically important to address nutrient deficiencies in undernourished people. There are several studies showing that, for example, an egg a day can reduce stunting by up to 47% in young babies when stunting levels are high. And there's growing evidence that it is impossible for babies to achieve adequate nutrition in the first 1,000 days of life without access to some livestock-derived foods. And now some human nutritionists are arguing that actually livestock-derived foods are essential for at least the first 3,000 days of life and continue to be an important part of a healthy diet, particularly for vulnerable sections of the population. But we have a challenge in relation to access to animal-sourced foods. This data comes from a study by IFPRI and Tufts University, and it shows the proportion or the percentage of the daily mean household income that needs to be spent on food if everyone was to have access to the Eat Lancet reference diet. Now, we can argue as to how relevant that Eat Lancet reference diet is in different parts of the world, but it does make an important point that if you look at the percentage of household income that needs to be spent on accessing this diet, you can see that for low-income countries, on average, it's about 100% of income. 100% of income. It is beyond the reach of large proportions and large percentages of people. Whereas in high-income countries, people can spend 5%, 10% of their income to access that diet. So we have a huge challenge in relation to access to high quality diets. Livestock are important for jobs and economic development. If you look at the contribution of livestock to GDP, it makes up about 40% of agricultural GDP on average. That varies from 15 to 80% in countries in Africa, depending on the structure of the livestock sector. And it's estimated that the market value of Africa's animal source foods will grow to about 150 billion by 2050. From a current base of about 37 billion. But it's really important to recognize that most livestock products are sold informally and locally. But it's also important to recognize that the various activities along the numerous livestock value chains in Africa provide huge numbers of jobs. Livestock value chains tend to generate much more employment than crop value chains, for example. It's a higher value product. There's more opportunity for adding value along the value chain. And over 500 million, there are over 500 million smallholder mixed livestock farmers in the world, of which 2/3 are women livestock keepers in rural areas. So women are really at the nexus. As I said, 2/3 of smallholder mixed crop livestock farmers in the world are women. Women have critical roles in household nutrition. It's women who often determine or who do determine the diet, what's being consumed in the household. But livestock can also be a means of bringing about transformative change in millions of women's lives because of the opportunities that livestock provide, not only in production, but all along the value chain, and providing opportunities for small businesses, for income generation, and really empowering women. Now, while I've said that animal sourced foods are highly nutritious for you and me, But of course, they're also highly nutritious to all sorts of nasty bugs that don't necessarily do us any good. So food safety is of concern in the livestock sector and in animal sourced foods. And this shows the health and economic burden of foodborne diseases, not just livestock products, but foodborne diseases in general. And you can see that the graph on the left-hand side shows the burden in DALIs in Asia, Africa, other developing countries, and developed countries. And you can see that microbial contamination of food in Africa, the green bar, represents a huge burden and a huge risk. We often hear a lot about, for example, the role of aflatoxins in food safety. But in relation to the burden, it is tiny compared to the microbial burden. And there are the estimates, and these are global estimates for the cost of the burden of food safety, show that productivity loss is costing about $95 billion a year. Just the treatment of illnesses, 15 billion. And the loss to trade is between $5 and $7 billion a year. So a huge economic loss due to challenges in food safety. I mentioned the fact that most livestock products are sold informally in informal markets. About 80% of livestock products are sold informally. But a recent study shows that 80% of the investment in food safety in Africa is in the formal sector. So it's actually missing the target completely, because most of the challenges are in the informal sector, but the investment is going into the formal sector. There's a need to refocus the investment in food safety to build capacity in the informal sector. There's also a need to move away from a hazard-based approach to a risk-based approach. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the way in which food safety is tackled in developed countries, for example, it's driven by two things: regulation and consumer pressure, basically. Supermarkets are terrified of a food scale. And the regulation tends to deal with eliminating hazards. Now, a hazard is something that could potentially cause you harm, but may not necessarily cause you harm. Whereas a risk is something that's highly likely to cause you harm. Let me use a simple example of milk. Bacterial contamination of milk might be a hazard. We might have brucellosis or TB in the milk. But if that milk is boiled before it's consumed, the hazard is eliminated and the risk is reduced. So we need to focus on where the risks are, what are the real risks, not what are the hazards, not what are the potential risks are, but what are the hazards. We need to build consumer awareness in food safety, and consumers are increasingly aware of food safety issues, including consumers who buy their food in the informal market. We've demonstrated in ILRI that you can go a long way by raising awareness in consumers, and critically important, focusing on the traders, the middlemen, who have a huge role to play in food safety. So by raising awareness amongst consumers, amongst traders, training traders in very simple aspects of food safety, we can go a long way to upgrading the food safety in informal markets. Because we know that regulation and implementation of regulation is a challenge in many countries in Africa. Of course, we need regulation and we want to continue to improve the regulatory framework, but we have to recognize that we can't just rely on that to improve food safety. And along with that, we can upgrade infrastructure, improve wet markets through simple interventions. I guess livestock in the environment is, at least in the developed countries, the Achilles heel of livestock. We hear lots about the life of livestock being blamed for climate change, for destruction of rainforests, for all sorts of public health challenges and issues. And of course, livestock have an impact on the environment. Livestock, ruminants in particular, emit greenhouse gases, methane. But there's a huge opportunity to tackle that in the livestock sector. This graph shows the greenhouse gas emission intensity and how it changes as milk yield in cows increases. Now, the greenhouse gas emission intensity is the amount of greenhouse gases emitted per unit of product. In other words, in this case, per litre of milk or per kilogram of milk. I should say, just in case you're confused by the axis in the graph, the FPCM means this has been converted to a standard fat and protein content across different studies. Now you can see that the left-hand side of this graph, at very low levels of productivity, which is where most cows in Africa sit, as you increase productivity, there's a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emission intensity. At the right-hand side of the graph, where production levels are high, you can see that increasing productivity really has very little impact. But we're dealing with this part of the graph inside that red ellipse. So the opportunity to reduce intensity of greenhouse gas emissions through increasing productivity is massive. Not only that, it's also possible to reduce absolute amounts of methane production. This study actually comes from India, it's not from Africa. I did this study, this modeling exercise with some colleagues in India when I was based there a few years ago. And it shows the impact of increasing daily milk production from about 2.5 up to 15 kilograms per day per animal on methane produced, total amounts of methane produced. So what is happening here is that as milk production per animal increases, you could supply India's milk demand with fewer animals and therefore reduce not only emission intensity, but absolute amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Let me now move on to say something about the effects of COVID. I'm just going to use this study as an example. It's a study on the effects of COVID on livestock value chains in 5 counties in northern Kenya. It was done by telephone, and we tried to look at the impacts all along the livestock value chain on different actors along that value chain. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of results to illustrate. Here you can see the effects on livestock markets and retailers. The top graph shows the numbers of animals sold in markets from January, and you can see a huge decline in sales of animals, apart from perhaps camels, but there are not many camels traded anyway. Maybe a slight recovery through May to June, but still, if you look at the June figures compared with the January figures, a big reduction in numbers of animals sold. The bottom graph shows the kilos of meat sold by butchers by month across the five counties in northern Kenya. And again, you can see a dramatic reduction in meat sold by butchers. If we look at the effects on consumers, there was a significant reduction in household incomes. There was a reduction in the consumption frequency of nutrient-dense dietary components such as meat, as we saw previously in the previous graph, eggs, fruits, vegetables, a reduction in the number and quality of meals consumed, and also a reduction in the number of ante and postnatal visits. For example, in Garissa County, for children between 6 and 59 months, there was a drop in micronutrient supplementation by to 30%. In May. And there are a number of studies being done, and they all kind of mirror what I've just shown from Kenya. At a recent meeting of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, which is a global multi-stakeholder platform that brings together stakeholders from all across the livestock spectrum, at a Africa regional meeting a couple of months ago, we found that people were reporting major value chain disruptions at all stages, suppliers, producers, traders, consumers, as I've demonstrated in the Kenyan study. We have to recognize that a lot of the effects of COVID are still largely unquantified because it's been difficult to access data. We're getting better data as we go along. And it may be that some of the impacts are underrated. But we have seen opportunities in, for example, better use and more use of digitization, digital extension, providing innovative options to reach people with more impact, and we might actually get there faster. So I think we might see a stimulation of the use of digital technologies because of COVID. And what it has thrown up is there's a huge opportunity to promote and accelerate the implementation of One Health approaches. Now, what do I mean by that? So One Health is a concept, excuse me, by which we can bring together animal health, human health, and environmental health, recognizing that there are interdependencies amongst those three sectors. So the One Health kind of sits at the middle of that. We need to be able to prevent the next pandemic. We need better surveillance systems, but we need surveillance systems in animals as well as humans. We tend to find the disease once it's reached the human population, when in fact, if we'd better animal surveillance systems, we might be able to detect it much earlier. And we know the earlier you detect a pandemic disease, the cheaper it is to control it and the less impact it has. So there's a huge incentive to get early surveillance systems in place. We can respond better by applying the latest science. We need to minimize the foodborne risks and hazards. But critically, we need to be able to respond in a more coordinated manner. It's not just about bringing together the disciplines of health, environment, human health, environment, and animal health. It's about bringing together the institutions that work in those areas. So it's about bringing together the Ministry of Livestock or the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Environment to work in a much more coordinated manner. Now, we know the challenges, of course, of getting government departments and government ministries together. But if we've got to deal with pandemics and reduce the risk of future pandemics, this is going to be absolutely critical. A recent report published by UNEP and ILRI looked at what do we need to do to prevent the next pandemic of zoonotic diseases. And that report identified 7 major drivers, anthropogenic drivers of zoonotic disease. The increasing demand for animal protein, a number of unsustainable agricultural intensification practices, increased use and exploitation of wildlife, unsustainable use of natural resources, changes in travel and transportation patterns, changes in food supply chains, and climate change. So if you look at those drivers, you can see why there's a need to bring together animal health, human health, and environmental health. What about investment in livestock, particularly in Africa? Well, if you look at the value, and this is the global commodity values of the top 10 agricultural commodities, you can see that 5 of those are animal-sourced foods. So we have milk, beef, cattle meat, chicken meat, pig meat, eggs, 5 of the top 10 agricultural commodities by global value. This shows the figure for 2018. If you look at the mean across the last 10 years, it shows a very similar pattern. Some years rice might be higher than milk, some years milk might be higher than rice, depending on commodity prices and so on. Now, I mentioned that livestock is 40% of agricultural GDP, ranging from 15 to 18 in individual countries. I now want to turn to the investment in livestock. This shows one indicator of investment, total ODA, official development assistance to developing countries. And you can see that it's been from 2007, it's been rising gradually. The red part of the histograms represents the investment in agriculture. It's about 4.5% total ODA. The green part of the bar represents the investment in livestock. Now, unless your eyesight is much better than mine, I can't even see the green part of the bar. But if we deconstruct that a little bit, show it on a slightly different scale, this shows the percentage, the red line shows the percentage of ODA on agriculture, and the last few years it's been hovering around 4.5%. And the green line shows livestock investment through ODA. Livestock gets less than 5% of the 4%, gets a tiny fraction of ODA assistance. And if you look at the expenditure by national governments, the picture is not much different. There are hardly any countries in Africa that invest 10% of their agricultural budget in livestock, and most countries invest less than 5% of their agricultural budget in livestock. So why is that? Why is there this underinvestment in livestock sector compared to its contribution to the economy? I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, I think the contribution of the livestock sector to development, to socioeconomic development, is underappreciated. And there are perhaps two reasons for that. There is a lack of empirical evidence to countervail those perceptions. There's a lack of empirical evidence on what the investment in the livestock sector could bring in terms of returns. And there's also a lack of good quality data in the livestock sector, which hampers the generation of that evidence. We know that even the simplest of livestock data, numbers of animals, for example, in many countries, are not very reliable. So we need to invest a lot more in good quality data in the livestock sector. Now, the Livestock Development Strategy for Africa sets out the Africa Union agenda for development of livestock in Africa to be able to enable the sector to contribute to the achievement of the Malabo Declaration commitments. But currently, livestock is very poorly represented in the CAADP process, and there are no livestock-specific indicators in the biennial review. Livestock does need to be thoroughly embedded in national agricultural investment plans and NDPs in mid-term economic frameworks. So at the moment, there is a group of livestock stakeholders under the leadership of AU IBAR, the Inter-African Bureau on Animal Resources, working to develop potential high-level indicators on the livestock sector that could be incorporated into the biennial review. And in fact, as we speak, there's a meeting going on today and tomorrow to drive this forward. Because if you don't have an indicator, if you're not measuring things, you're not going to have any way of knowing whether you're making progress, and you're going to have any way of whether you should be investing more in that sector. As part of this, we at ILRI believe that national livestock master plans can play a key role. As I said, there is underinvestment in livestock. Agriculture and livestock ministers don't have the evidence on what the return on investment could be, so that when they go to talk to the Ministry of Finance, they don't get a very good hearing because there's no real, evidence-based case for investment in livestock. There's also a lack of human capacity and quantitative livestock sector planning and analysis in most governments. So if we're going to get to the stage of having realistic action plans with targets and so on, we need tools to be able to develop those plans. So a livestock master plan is a 5-year investment plan or a roadmap with specific targets, goals, a strategy, and a budget of financial and human resources required. It's based on quantitative, fact-based analysis, based on a number of quantitative models. It consists of a baseline sector analysis, a long-run foresight, 15-year foresight analysis, and then a 5-year investment plan. And we've been working, ILRI has been working with a number of governments to develop those plans. The first one was for Ethiopia. We were approached by the Ethiopian Ministry of Agriculture to help develop a master plan, because the state minister said, as I've described, every time I go to my finance minister to argue for more investment in livestock, he says, well, where's your evidence? Where's your plan? They didn't have one. So this plan was produced to provide strategies, targets, investment targets. The timing was good because it fed into the development of the government of Ethiopia's second 5-year growth and transition plan. Now, we don't have a complete analysis of what the impact has been, but we estimate that this livestock master plan for Ethiopia has to date resulted in about $300 million of public sector investment, and perhaps more importantly, $200 million of private sector investment. So it's leveraged about $500 million of investment into the livestock sector in the last 3 to 4 years. So far, we've completed plans for Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Rwanda in Africa, and plans are currently in progress for Gambia and Kenya. And there are about 10 other countries in Africa that have expressed interest in developing livestock master plans. So that's the investment side. So how do we build resilience and build resilient livestock systems? Obviously, in the wake of COVID, resilience and resilient are key are key buzzwords now. So I think there are 3 steps towards building resilience. This is perhaps a bit of an oversimplification, but it's a useful way of thinking about it. The first is to protect the assets. In this case, the livestock themselves. Keep them alive, keep them healthy, make sure they don't die of drought or lack of feed or disease. So protect the assets, keep them, not only the livestock, but the land that people need access to raise livestock, water, the other resources need, so protect the assets. The second is to improve productivity. And we've got lots of technologies to improve productivity, but at the moment they're not being deployed very effectively. And the third is to enhance markets and improve value chain performance. So let me run through each of those in turn very briefly. Here is one example, and it's only one example of something that can be done to protect assets. It's index-based livestock insurance, particularly for pastoral areas, where one of the major causes of mortality in livestock is drought and lack of feed, lack of water. So more than 10 years ago, ILRI started developing an index-based livestock insurance product that was offered in northern Kenya, then in southern Ethiopia. In 2015, the government of Kenya introduced the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program based on this model, which is a public-private partnership. At the moment, that is subsidized to 18,000 vulnerable households in 8 Kenyan counties, but there are plans to scale that up to 100,000 households across 14 counties, with only partial subsidy rather than full subsidy. And the World Food Programme has been offering subsidized coverage in the Somali region of Ethiopia since about 2018, covering 15,000 households. My view is that this is unlikely ever to be fully commercially viable product, but that does not mean to say it's not highly effective, because it's much cheaper to invest some public resources and public finance into this sort of product than go in after a disaster has struck and you're trying to provide food aid, trying to reach to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. You're trying to restock livestock and so on. So it's much better to prevent that through a limited amount of public investment rather than having to deal with the aftermath of drought. This has generated a lot of interest in other countries around the continent. A number of countries have asked for feasibility studies to be conducted. We've done that in Djibouti, Somalia, and Niger. Studies are ongoing in Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Senegal. And last year, along with ILRI, IGAD organized a high-level ministerial meeting where we had 7 ministers of agriculture or livestock from IGAD countries interested in how can we scale up this regionally. And late last year, the World Bank, African Development Bank, and EU launched the Horn of Africa initiative, aimed at scaling up index-based livestock insurance at a regional level across the IGAD countries. A regional product is much more attractive to the private sector, the insurance companies, than a national product, because clearly they can spread the risk over a much larger number of countries rather than just having the risk in one country. There's a huge opportunity to improve productivity. The milk yield of a cow in sub-Saharan Africa is only 6% of that in an OECD country. A lot of opportunity to raise productivity through better feeding, better breeding, better animal health services, and there are technologies available. We can leapfrog many of the technologies that have helped the livestock sector in the developed world over the last 50 years. An example would be genomic-based selection. You no longer have to set up large-scale performance measurement trials to identify the best bulls, the best dairy bulls. We can do that genomically. Last year, we had the very first sale in Tanzania of genomically selected dairy cattle. The first sale in Africa of genomically selected dairy cattle was held in Tanzania last year. There's opportunities to introduce improved forages. An example would be brachiaria. Brachiaria is a forage of grass that's native to East Africa. It was exported to Latin America 100 years ago. Improved varieties were bred there, and it transformed the beef sector, the meat sector in Latin America. Huge areas of improved brachiaria are now planted in Latin America. We've reintroduced some brachiaria of those improved varieties, and those varieties are now being used in 14 countries around Africa. There are new vaccines to protect animals against disease. But it's critically important that these technologies and interventions are responsive to the needs of different categories of farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, responsive to the needs of women as well as men. And maybe let me give you an example of what I mean. East Coast fever is a disease of cattle that kills about 1 million calves, 1 million cattle in East Africa every year. There is a vaccine, it's highly effective, it's 95% effective, but it's sold in vials of 40 doses. If you've got 3 cows producing, 1 calf every year or 2 calves every year, a 40 dose vial is no good to you. So we've been persuading the distributors that they need to package this vaccine in much smaller doses. It's akin to packaging crop seeds or fertilizer in small packs rather than 50 kilo packs. So getting the technology right, delivering it in the right way is critically important. Let me also explain or give you an example of where the needs of women might be different to the needs of men, or the perceptions might be different. Sticking to the East Coast fever vaccine example, we can vaccinate the calves, 95% effective. Sounds like a good idea. Men think it's wonderful. You go and ask the woman in the village or the woman of the household, they'll say, well, not so sure if it's such a good idea. If all these calves survive, it's a lot more work for us. We've got to feed them. We don't have enough feed for them. Where do we find the feed? We've got to spend many more hours feeding, looking for feed, less time to look after our children and to cook. So the perception of improved, in inverted commas, technologies might be very different when you ask a woman compared to a man. There's a lot needs to be done in terms of improving markets and value chain development. And this list is not exhaustive. It's only a few examples. We need much better understanding of the demand side and market information systems. We need a collective action for economies of scale, bringing farmers together for economies of scale purposes, but also to provide them with an opportunity of more bargaining power, institutional and value chain capacity building and food safety. I've mentioned that before. Better processing infrastructure investment in cold chain, a lot of opportunities for digital technologies and digital products such as finance, e-commerce, and so on. We need policies that promote interregional markets, and of course the Africa Free Trade area offers a lot of opportunity there. Branding and certification of livestock products. Access to capital and credit is critical for all value chain actors. Many of the credit products available are often not suitable for the livestock sector, for the peculiarities of livestock and livestock production. But there is no point in providing access to credit for some actors in the value chain if the next person in that value chain can't get access to credit to improve their business. It has to be done across the whole value chain. So providing capital and credit to the whole value chain and all the actors in the value chain is important. And of course, it's the private sector that's really got to drive the development of the livestock sector. Public sector purse is not large enough. So we really need an enabling environment to encourage private sector investment. I mean, the AGRA report last year on the hidden middle really highlighted it. It's this hidden middle of small and medium-sized enterprises that are going to continue to drive agricultural transformation in Africa. So that sector needs access to capital. It needs an enabling environment to let it thrive and to encourage investment. Finally, I just want to draw attention to the report that Usman mentioned at the beginning, which was produced by the Malabo-Montpellier panel a couple of months ago, Meat, Milk and More, Policy Innovations to Shepherd Inclusive and Sustainable Livestock Systems in Africa. They came up with 7 recommendations that would help create this enabling environment I've been talking about, with some specific recommendations around individual sectors, and 4 case studies. As Usman said, the panel looks around for countries that have been doing things successfully and uses those as case studies. So there are case studies from Ethiopia, Uganda, South Africa, and Mali. So if you haven't read that report, I would recommend it to you, which you can get on the Malabo-Montpellier website. Let me stop there, Usman, and hand back to you. Thanks very much to everyone for listening.
Very good, Ian. Thank you for a tour de force very comprehensive presentation on livestock, the challenges, the potentials, the options, the best practices, and the recommendations to close from the Malabo Montpellier panel report. What I would like to do now is to open for discussion. The questions can be sent through the chat box. They can also be sent via email to our team, but I think they prefer the chat box. So I will be reading your questions for Ian to respond. All right, so the floor is now open for questions for Ian. And let me, of course, use this opportunity to welcome many of our friends who are around the audience here. Panel member Ishmael Sunga, Carlos Seri, who was an advisor on the report. Carlos, good to see you. And our friends from GIZ, and those are the few names that I've seen starting here. So the floor is open for your questions. Please send your email, your chats through the chat box. I'll be happy to forward them to Ian. So the first question has come in, Ian, and this is from Natalia Nuremberg. Can you elaborate on how the productivity increase per cow could increase total greenhouse gas emissions? How would productivity increase lead to increased total GHG emissions?
Thank you. No, the point I was making that productivity increases per cow could lead to a decrease in total greenhouse gas emissions. So if you...
So the opposite.
Yeah, so if you have a cow that's producing, let's say 1 kilogram of milk per day, it's producing a lot of methane, it's not producing a lot of milk. So the amount of methane produced per kilogram of milk is very high. If you double that milk production or triple it to 3 kilograms per milk per day, you might be feeding that cow better. So the absolute emission per cow might go up slightly, but you're spreading those emissions across 3 kilograms of milk as opposed to 1 kilogram of milk. So the amount of methane per kilogram of milk is reduced dramatically. So if you, in theory, it's not quite as simple as this, but if you doubled milk production per cow, you could produce the same amount of milk with half the number of cows. So total greenhouse gas emissions would go down. That, of course, assumes that demand is static. And we know that demand is not static, it's growing. So that if you put the demand side into the equation, you might not achieve an absolute reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, depending on how fast the demand is growing. The example I used in India was you could produce, the same amount of milk that's demanded in India by half the number of cows. And by the way, we know in India you could do that with existing feed supply, because we did that analysis. But of course, the demand is going up. You can't just reduce the number of cows by half because you're going to have to produce more milk. So it's a bit of an oversimplification, but the point I want to make is that under some circumstances, it's not only the emission intensities that go down as you increase productivity, you might be able to reduce absolute emissions as well.
Okay, very good. I think the question was all meant to exactly say how could it lower, and you explained it very well. So I think that is good. Thank you for that. There is here a couple more questions from Carlos. The decline in meat consumption observed in Kenya soon after the onset of COVID, what was that primarily attributable to? What explained that decline in meat consumption just after the onset of COVID? A decline in demand due to economic shock, or a supply problem due to some source of injury in the food production systems, or something else? What led to that decrease?
Okay, I think that question is from David Aronson, not from Carlos. Carlos's question is above that, but let me respond to David's question. So the decline in consumption was both a demand shock.
Oh, sorry, you're right. Okay,
we can come
you're reading what I'm reading. Okay, good.
The decline was due to both a demand shock and a supply shock. There was a demand shock because clearly the economy was affected when things get locked down. People don't have income to spend. But there was also supply shock in the sense that due to lockdown of activities, markets were physically closed. So people couldn't actually bring livestock to the markets. So there was, there was a reduction in demand, but also a significant reduction in supply to the market because of the physical effects of lockdown and people not being able to move, markets being shut down, and so on. So it was a combination of both demand side and supply side.
Excellent. Then let's go to the other Carlos Serre now. How could the alignment of public and private investments in the livestock sector be improved? Livestock systems require particularly synergistic interventions. Silver bullets don't work. So do you have a multicolored bullet, and how would it look like?
Absolutely, Carlos. Silver bullets don't work. And what we mean by that is it's very rare in the livestock sector that one particular technology or one particular investment has a huge transformative effect. So, for example, if you improve the genetic potential of livestock, unless you to increase productivity, at the same time, you've got to be able to provide more feed. Otherwise, you don't get the benefit of the improved genetics. At the same time, you've got to provide better animal healthcare services. If you have crossbred cows as opposed to local breeds, they might be more susceptible to diseases. So you've got to put packages together and not rely on silver bullets. Now, how do we get alignment between public sector and private sector investment? Maybe let me go back to the Ethiopian example when I said that the Ethiopian Livestock Master Plan had stimulated about $300 million of public sector and $200 million of private sector investment. And as I have to say, those are rather crude estimates. We don't have very good data. We need to go and do a proper study. Some of the public sector investment came because of a large World Bank project, which is heavily influenced by the Livestock Master Plan. But critically important, what the private sector investors tell us is that with the development of the Livestock Master Plan, which, as I said, has to involve all stakeholders. So wasn't just the ministry. The ministry was in the driving seat. It was their plan, but there was strong engagement during the whole process with the private sector, with representatives of the traders associations, the farmers, and so on. So they got the message that the government was serious about the livestock sector. The government was serious about the livestock sector. It was putting effort into develop a plan, a roadmap, an investment plan. So that gave confidence to the private sector to invest. So I think the first point is the private sector has to have confidence. It has to see investment in livestock as not being risky. So it needs the appropriate business environment, de-risking, and so on, and so on. So that's the first point. The other is that I think something like that a livestock master plan can help identify the areas that need investment from the private sector. So therefore, it can help inform the sort of what else needs to be done. If you want the private sector to invest in dairy or beef or chickens or whatever it is, what does government need to do to unlock that investment from the private sector? So it might be, giving, I don't know, tax incentives. It might be setting up agri-processing parks. It'll be context specific, but I think that plan can help identify what governments need to do to work to encourage that private sector investment, whether it's about ensuring the right credit facilities are available or whatever. And then the third point is that in some cases, it might be setting up public-private partnerships where you would get alignment between private sector investment and public sector investment. There are many services that governments have traditionally provided, but they're very bad at providing those services. Animal healthcare services, for example. A lot of that can be privatized through encouragement of investment in animal healthcare, for example, but there are still some aspects of animal healthcare where you do need public sector investment, pandemics, classic example. There are public good animal health services that you do need to provide, but the private sector might be much better at providing it than the public sector providing it itself. So the public sector can provide the environment, maybe provide some of the financial resources to encourage the private sector to invest. So that's another mechanism by which you would get alignment between the public sector and the private sector investment. So I think those are 3 ways it could be done.
Quick follow-up on that from me. The response in Ethiopia is good, and that's what also would expect. And that's why these livestock master plans are really important and critical. You have started in a couple more countries. Are you seeing the same signs? I know it's too early there, but are the signs pointing in the same direction?
It's earlier days for other countries. Ethiopia was the first one.
Okay.
Tanzania, we've not had the same response. There are various budgetary and political reasons for that I don't necessarily want to go into in great detail. There was very strong support in Ethiopia at all levels of government, from Prime Minister's office down. And the timing was very crucial because it was being done just before the government started to develop its second growth and transformation plan. So the state minister for livestock had a huge, bag of evidence in those discussions. And that really helped because there was a plan, showed return on investment. Okay, so there was the evidence base. So the timing was lucky in that. And we all know that in terms of influencing political processes and decisions, timing is all. Timing is critical.
It's everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. I got a couple of questions here from Antoinette Sala, who is a farming and food consultant. And welcome, Antoinette. Good to have you with us again. So she got a couple of questions. Let me start with the first one. How best can these success stories that you have highlighted here be emulated or scaled up across the continent by governments in order to meet national and international commitments to agricultural growth and transformation? How do you see these success stories spreading across the continent? So what needs to happen for that to happen?
Yeah. So I think things like the livestock development strategy for Africa provides a sort of platform to help that, because it provides a mechanism by which those discussions can be convened by the AU. Now the challenge is, of course, that the resources to implement that strategy for Africa are tiny. They're almost insignificant. So I think if we can make the case for the investment, there are mechanisms through the AU and others and so on that can help scale up by bringing countries together. The African Development Bank at the moment is developing a livestock investment master plan at the continental level to help guide its investment. And it wants to start engaging with and discussing with its regional member countries how and what would they like to see invested in livestock to then guide, the design of investment decisions from the African Development Bank. So I think there are a number of mechanisms by which these examples can be shared as part of the development of this livestock investment master plan for the African Development Bank, and I'm chairing the technical working group that's supporting that. We are proposing to develop a sort of clearinghouse or a database of success stories and technologies that we know work and make them available. So, if you want to know how to improve, I don't know, some aspect of the dairy value chain in wherever, X country in Nigeria, you could go there and see, well, how did this country do it? What worked and what didn't work? So making that information available in some sort of digital platform would help. So I think there are a number of things that can be done.
Excellent. I think that would be really a nice service, Ian, a platform for good practices and success factors to facilitate cross-learning and push the agenda a little bit. I think there's so much promise around livestock and so much wealth to get from there that speeding up that process is going to be extremely important. Then, of course, here specific focus, you mentioned women in your presentation about the different objectives and interests in the trajectory of the sector's growth. And Antoine is asking a second question, wanting to know, the continent being, really rich in livestock, which is the most valuable agricultural asset for rural and urban poor alike, especially women. So she's interested to know, in your view, women representing 70% of the active population, how can a woman-focused livestock sector emerge? What needs to happen for that to take place?
A really interesting question. And I wish my colleague, Nicoline Dehaan, who...
And I mean, Antoine might be broader than livestock, but let's perhaps just focus it on livestock. How would one make sure that livestock responds straight to the needs of the woman in the sector? Mm.
So it's a really interesting question, Usman, and I wish my colleague Nicoline Dehaan, who runs the CGIR platform on gender and agriculture, was here, because she would be able to wax eloquent, much more eloquently on this topic than I can. So I think there are a number of things that are specific or are different to the livestock sector compared with the crop sector, for example. We know that in many countries, women have very limited or no access to land. They can't get access to land, but they often have access to livestock, because you don't need land to be able to, you don't always need land to raise livestock. And of course, we know that women provide a lot of the labor to look after livestock, but they don't necessarily benefit from the economic income. The women rear livestock, and then the men sell them and take the money. So there's that aspect in terms of, how can women benefit? But I don't think it's just about benefiting from rearing livestock. It's also the opportunities that might be along the value chain in marketing and so on, livestock. And it can be small, it can be poultry. You can start small. It doesn't have to be cattle and sheep and goats and camels and so on. One of the things that's coming out, or one of the recent things that's coming out of research about how you can help transform women's lives, is also to engage men. A lot of recent research is showing that you can't just focus on women. It doesn't work. You have to bring men into the conversation as well. But that is not often what happens. But it's becoming clear that if we're going to improve the lives of women, men have got to be part of the conversation as well.
Don't you have subsectors in livestock that are more women-friendly or perhaps more important to women? Wouldn't, for example, poultry or small ruminants be more important for women than cattle and dairy?
Yes, because the barriers to entry are much lower. You don't need...
And wouldn't more investment and support in those areas be more women-friendly?
Yes. So, investment in, small-scale poultry, for example, backyard poultry, it's not too difficult to get into that, providing eggs to the local market or chickens and so on. But we do know that there exists what we call a livestock ladder. That you can start with poultry, and as you generate income and build up a little bit of cattle, then you might go and buy a goat, and eventually you might buy a dairy cow. So we have this kind of what we classically call a livestock ladder, where you can start with small, poultry, small ruminants, and eventually move into large ruminants. Moving straight into dairy or large ruminants is difficult, because you don't have the capital to be able to do that. But you can start. There's definitely a lot of truth in starting small.
But also this just, if you have to help a subsector grow and modernize and transform, and you have limited resources, perhaps you can level the playing field by also maybe perhaps choosing subsectors to expand and grow wealth and transform that are much more speaking to women, so to say. And I've seen that in some of the peri-urban areas and urban areas, poultry and women involvement in poultry is much more important than men, for example, and that could be a good market to modernize. I don't know all the challenges there. I'm just speaking as a layperson here. But let me ask the additional questions we have here. And this is an important one coming from Kalawole Odobode. And he's asking, are there underlying factors that predispose African governments to identify more with crops and crop production to the detriment of livestock production, despite the kilogram to kilogram advantage of livestock and meat products? Is there a bias there?
Yeah, I often think about that, and it's not unique to Africa. I don't have I have my views on why that's so. I don't have a kind of detailed analysis. I think it comes about because of clearly, if you're coming from a time where there was not enough to eat, the focus was invest in staple crops because people were hungry. They needed calories, and you saw that around many parts of the world. You saw it in South Asia with the Green Revolution in the 60s. It was about producing more food because people were hungry. And in South Asia, millions of people were dying of hunger. So of course the priority is to produce more food, more cereals, more carbohydrates. And I think that once that gets into the mindset of politicians, it takes a long time to change. You almost have to wait for a new generation, because I think that those policies were driven by people, who had or have experienced hunger. So agricultural policy tends to be driven by what happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. It was the same in the UK. Agricultural policy in the UK was driven for 30 years by what happened in the Second World War, when food was rationed. So it takes a long time for agricultural policy to change. So I think this fixation on crops is part of that historical legacy that takes a long time to change. And I don't know if there are any people from Ministries of Agriculture online, but Ministries of Agriculture tend to be very conservative. They don't change quickly compared with some other ministries. So I think there's a time lag effect there.
Very good, thanks.
That's my perception.
Go ahead.
I don't have a detailed analysis as to whether that's correct, but that's my perception.
Okay, very good. Still talking about crops and livestock. The only attention is not in terms of attention, but also we know that herders and farmers and the conflicts and so on. And this is a real issue. How do you see that evolving and being resolved? Do you think that a livestock sector based on transhumance is sustainable long term? And if not, what are good trajectories to get to a better place? We know that land is getting more scarce, urbanization expanding, deforestation is taking place. So moving cattle around is going to be a very tough option, but it looks like a very sticky practice, very, very hard to change. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that pastoral systems and transhuman systems and moving animals around and so on are viewed by many people as being kind of backward and not progressive and so on. So there's definitely that perception, including in government at many levels. But we do know that in those dryland areas where you can't do much else than grow livestock, it's actually a very efficient way of using those resources. But of course, it's under huge pressure from population growth, encroachment by agriculture and cropping and so on. And you see the conflicts and whether it's in East Africa, conflicts on the Sahel between different ethnic groups that come from different agricultural and pastoral traditions. So it's under huge pressure. And many of the kind of traditional and customary ways in which these livestock and landscapes were managed are breaking down because of that pressure. But I do believe that there is still huge potential in pastoral systems. But there are challenges in terms of reinventing or changing the way in which they're managed and governed, because I say many of the traditional governance customary structures are breaking down. But we can build and learn from some of those and kind of bring them up to date. So for example, we've been working on what's called participatory land use planning, participatory rangeland management, kind of builds on those customary ideas, but it recognizes that you're dealing with a new, you have county governments, regional governments, national governments, and they have to be part of the discussions and part of the solution. So by bringing people together and trying to figure out, well, what do we want to do? And then what's the role of the local communities, the county governments, the provincial government, the national government, and so on, to help deal with these conflicts and come to some sort of resolution that allow people to continue to be pastoralists, to continue to raise animals. Now, interestingly, I became aware today of, and I forget what it's called, but IGAD has just released a document that is a commitment amongst the 11 IGAD member states to allow for free movement of livestock across the IGAD member state boundaries. I mean, it's regulated in the sense that you've got to demonstrate, where the animals have come from, and you get a certificate when you cross the border, and where are you going, and so. But at least an attempt to try and deal with some of those issues and kind of regularize them. And deal with issues of animal health and transboundary animal diseases. So I haven't had a chance to look at that document, but it seemed to me that that was at least a step forward, recognizing that you have these traditional movement of animals and people who don't respect national boundaries for historical and cultural reasons, and trying to facilitate that to continue.
Good. Then let me move the question from Mera Shah from Imperial College. Thank you first, Ian, for a great presentation. And then she's asking, in some countries like Somalia, and you were just right on the horn, the livestock animal of choice is camel, rather than cattle or small ruminants. So what are some of the advances made in the camel sector? And where are the key gaps? Where would you see them? And where do you think Africa's camel countries can learn best practices from?
Okay, I must admit I'm not an expert on camels, but we have seen an increase in the camel population in many countries in the Horn of Africa as rainfall declines, more droughts, and so on. So we have seen a significant increase in the camel population because of that. And we've seen some interesting developments in the marketing of camel products, camel milk, for example. I can go a couple of kilometers from my house here in Nairobi and buy camel ice cream in the supermarket. So I think there are opportunities for developing camel products. At the moment, they might be niche markets, but they're there. So I think there are opportunities to develop that. Where can Africa's camel countries learn best from? I spent some time in India, and I think there are things that can be learned from some of the Western states in India, Rajasthan, for example, which has a significant camel population and a long history of camel rearing. And I've also had to deal with some of these issues around access to resources, land conflicts, and so on. So I think there are some examples in other countries. Maybe Rajasthan and India would be one place I would look to see what's happening there and what could be learned from there.
Yeah. And plus also some of the rural areas in the Middle East that are much more similar to what you would find in the Horn as well, with very small, tiny herds and really scattered holdings across the desert areas. Let me move to the question about animal welfare. And before we get to that, there was just a comment by Carlos. I don't know whether you want to comment on that a little bit further. When we're talking about the livestock sector and how to move it forward and regulate things and invest more. So his comment is that a key issue is that livestock is largely informal, and those fiscally public investments are not really attractive. So government basically looking at an informal sector and perhaps is not doing much either because I guess it's not a big source of fiscal resources, or because it's informal, they're not investing enough in it. Do you have any comments on that comment? Which is not a question, but just fiscal issues and public investment around the livestock sector.
It's very true what Carlos says. But one of the things that I've noticed in Kenya, if you take the northern counties of Kenya, which are basically livestock dominated, what I've noticed is that with devolution and with much more power, and agriculture is a devolved topic now in Kenya, what I've noticed is that, not initially with devolution, because there was very little capacity at the county level, but as that capacity is growing, I have seen much more interest and investment in the livestock sector from those county governments, because they're much closer to the ground and the local systems and people than the central government in Nairobi. So I've seen an increased interest in investing in the livestock sector because it's such a critical component of the economy and the development challenges of those individual counties, which kind of gets lost by the time you get up to central government level. So I think devolution has helped interest in public investment in the livestock sector.
Very good. I think it's great, and perhaps miss the interest of both sides, right? Local governments can get some fiscal resources raised, but then the demand to invest in livestock is heard probably better and louder because of the proximity.
Yep.
And then there's the whole issue of animal welfare, which we don't talk about quite a bit. And the question is from Natalia again. So how does one assess the willingness in African countries to integrate animal welfare principles into the livestock sector? Is it a topic of importance, or, and I will add, sorry, Natalia, of interest at all? Is it of importance, or is it of interest at all?
Well, if you put animal health and welfare together, of course, it's a huge topic of importance. If you take the non-health aspects of animal welfare, then, I mean, at the moment, to be honest, it's not a huge topic of interest in most of Africa or of African governments. But if Africa is interested in exporting, as some countries, particularly in Southern Africa, are, Botswana, Namibia, and so on, now exporting beef, for example. If that export market grows, and it is something that will have to be, will have to move up the agenda. It will assume much more importance if markets in developed countries are being accessed, because both the regulation and the consumers demand that it be addressed.
How does one prevent that from morphing into some type of protectionism? Is there one way of catering for animal welfare? Are there different ways of doing it? Will it end up becoming a barrier?
Well, yeah, we know that governments are always, looking for ways of imposing non-tariff barriers on trade. And my own country is no different to most. So yeah, there's always that risk. I mean, you see
it at some point, right?
You see it, and you see animal health also being used as an excuse. When there's an outbreak of a disease in the Horn of Africa, the Gulf states shut down the markets for livestock into the Gulf states. Whether that's justified on a truly animal health basis is another matter. In many cases, I don't think it necessarily is. So yeah, there's always a risk that governments will use those as excuses.
But it's one of those things, it's very hard to say no or you're against without looking really, really terrible and bad. Yet the other side is proponent for it is not just doing it because they want to be good to the animals. Just like asking for higher wages in developing countries, you're not doing it because you worry about people's livelihoods, because you want to raise costs of production. Yet it's very hard to say we don't want to raise wages, right? So perhaps here the point might be to allow heterogeneity of means, that you have ways of taking care of animal welfare that are not necessarily the standards that one would want to impose in a different market, or not even the same instruments, right? But the principle can be applied, and the tools and methods should be probably allowed to vary, right? So we got 3 or 4 more minutes to go. Let me ask this question from Antoinette Sala. Is the master plan, the livestock master plan, in the livestock master plan, Is there a focus on local breeding programs and artificial insemination? Are those major components of the livestock master plan?
That depends on what the priorities of the government are. I mean, these livestock master plans start with what does the government want to achieve, and therefore where should the investment be? So, for example, if a government is interested in developing the livestock export market,
oh, we're just about to lose you.
We lost you, Usman. I think you're back. Yeah, so it depends on what the government priorities are. So the baseline is what are the government's priorities? Because if you want to reduce poverty or if you want to increase food supply, I mean, your investment priorities might be slightly different. If gender is an important part of your national priorities, then the investments would look different. So the starting point is what does the government want to achieve from its livestock sector? And then you work back, you work from there. So it looks different in every country. So whether there's a focus on local breeding or, within breed improvement, for example, of local breeds, or you use AI either to bring in crossbreeds, again, will depend on the context. And it might be both. I mean, you might decide that, because you've got to disaggregate the country regionally. It's not just one big plan. It's usually divided into kind of agroecological zones. And you might conclude that in some areas, you want to focus your investment in preserving local breeds and improving them through within breed selection, for example. But you might decide that, if you're in the highlands of East Africa, there's an opportunity to bring in crossbred dairy cattle because you can feed them. There's enough feed available. So it's very context specific. It's not a one size fits all.
Okay, excellent. The time is up. We didn't have enough. It's very hard to get enough of the discussion here. It is really, really exciting, very, very important topics. And I think we could spend probably hours and hours again discussing that. So thank you, Ian, for a tour de force, very comprehensive. I think we all learned quite a lot here. Thank you for your time. And again, thank you for the great input into the report. It's greatly appreciated. We made it a much better report, thanks to you and Carlos and others. So to the audience as well, thank you very much for all of us being here with us today. I wouldn't like to hang up without asking Nabu to talk about the next webinar, just for you to be ready for that. I think it's going to be around nutrition. Nabu, do you want to say something to the audience?
Sure, and thank you again to speakers for great presentation and moderation. Thank you to participants for lively discussions. We look forward welcoming you Monday, so December 14th. The topic of that webinar will be, as Dr. Badian has said, on nutrition. The title is Creating a Resilient and Sustainable Food System in Africa for Healthy Diet, Policy Innovation and Intervention from Across the Continent. It will be presented by Prof. Cheryl Hendricks, who is a MAMO panel member, and she's also the head of the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics Extension and Rural Development from the University of Pretoria. So we thank everyone